Okay, let's unpack this. We often use the word citizen, right? But we don't always stop and really think about what it means.
Mm.
Is it just, a label on your passport? Is it about voting, paying taxes?
All those things come to mind.
Yeah, exactly. And the concept of citizenship feels pretty simple on the surface, but if you dive just a little deeper, you find all these layers. History, rights, duties, complex relationships. What does it really mean to belong to a political community?
It's a fundamental question.
Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your stack of sources, the articles, the research, the notes you've shared with us, and we really navigate the fascinating ideas packed inside them.
Mhm.
And today, we are plunging into some really rich material you've provided that unpacks this complex and, well, constantly evolving concept of citizenship.
And it really is quite a journey this material takes us on. It starts right at the foundation.
Yeah.
The basic nature of citizenship, that essential two-way street between the individual and the state. Then it traces the history. Where did this idea come from? Different eras, different places. It looks at the key components, what makes up citizenship today, specifically, you know, civil, political, and social rights.
Right, the big three.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it explores different theoretical takes. What's citizenship for? What's its purpose, its foundation? And finally, it looks at some really important critiques, ones that challenge how inclusive, how effective it actually is in practice
Yeah.
for everyone.
So our mission today, wading through your sources here, is basically to be your guides. We'll highlight the most important insights, try to connect the dots between all these different aspects, and hopefully help you understand the different layers of meaning and, frankly, the debates surrounding this absolute fundamental part of political life. We want you to walk away from this deep dive feeling truly well-informed about all the complexities here.
Sounds like a plan.
So let's start right at the very beginning. The basic definition in your source material, it says citizenship is the status of being a full and responsible member of a political community.
Full and responsible.
Yeah.
Key words.
Yeah. And it's described as this core idea that the individual owes allegiance to the state.
Okay.
And in return for that allegiance, those duties, they receive protection from the state. It's laid out really clearly as this crucial reciprocal two-way relationship.
Yeah, that two-way street image is absolutely central in the material you shared. You can almost picture it, like the source suggests.
Yeah.
On one side, you've got the individual.
Right.
They owe allegiance. They have duties, obligations towards the state. That's the responsibility side.
Mm-hmm.
Then on the other side, you have the state. It grants protection. It extends civil, political, social rights to the individual. That's the benefit, the security side.
Okay.
And it's this balance, this kind of dynamic exchange that forms the bedrock of citizenship in this framework. It's not just the state doing things for you, and it's not just you obeying the state. It's this constant interaction, mutual dependency, really.
And the material makes a really key distinction right up front, which helps grasp why this concept was such a big deal. A revolutionary shift, almost.
Yeah.
It's the difference between a subject and a citizen.
Ah, yes. That's crucial.
This is where it gets really interesting because it's the move from being ruled to being, well, part of the rule.
Precisely. A subject, if you look back historically, was subservient, usually to the state, or maybe more accurately, to the ruler, or a privileged class who just inherited the right to rule.
Right.
Their position was simply being ruled over, often without any real inherent rights against that power. But a citizen is fundamentally different because citizens constitute the state themselves. They are part of the sovereign body.
Okay.
The right to rule in a community of citizens isn't reserved for a select few by birth or status. No, it's decided by some kind of prescribed procedure, something meant to express the will of the general body of members,
Like voting, for instance.
like voting or other forms of participation. And crucially, this process is supposed to happen without discrimination, without considering things like race, religion, gender, place of birth. All those factors historically used to keep people out of power.
Right.
So this move from subject to citizen represents a profound change in political thinking and practice, a move towards a more inclusive form of community, though, often imperfectly realized in practice.
It completely flips the script, doesn't it? Instead of being under the power collectively, you are the power through this procedure. Which brings us to T.H. Marshall. He's a key figure in your sources, right? especially his work Citizenship and Social Class from 1950.
Oh, absolutely. Marshall is foundational for a lot of the modern understanding presented here.
And he really zeroes in on what this full membership actually
He
implies.
does. His observation is that citizenship implies full membership in a community, and importantly, those who have this status are considered equal regarding the rights and duties that come with it.
Equal status.
Yes, this idea of equality just inherent in being a citizen, that having the status gives you a baseline equality with the state and other citizens, that's a really powerful idea. It cuts against hierarchies, based on birth or wealth.
But he adds a warning, doesn't he?
He does, and the material emphasizes this. Marshall adds a crucial caveat. He acknowledges that different societies will define the specific rights and duties differently. It depends on their history, their culture, their political struggles. There isn't one universal shopping list that applies everywhere, always.
So the status implies equality, but the content of that equality can vary.
Exactly. What rights you get, what duties you owe that can look different in different places.
And that leads right into this distinction the material makes between formal and substantive citizenship, which feels really critical for understanding the reality on the ground. It's one thing to have citizenship in law, formally, right? To have the passport, the legal recognition.
Sure, the paperwork.
Yeah, but it's another thing entirely for all the rights that are supposed to come with it to be practiced and enjoyed equally by everyone in that society.
Exactly. Formal citizenship is just the legal status the state grants. Substantive citizenship is the lived reality, actually enjoying the full range of benefits, protections, participation opportunities that status is supposed to bring.
And the source says it's possible to have one without the other.
Absolutely. The source explicitly states, and this is a key takeaway, that it's entirely possible for groups of citizens to hold formal citizenship, but be denied substantive citizenship, because some rights are effectively blocked or withheld in actual practice, even if the law says otherwise.
The legal status is there, but the practical reality isn't.
Precise.
And when that happens, when substantive citizenship is denied, when the law doesn't match reality, the material says groups often resort to social movements.
Yes. And these aren't just theoretical exercises in political action. This is about real people, organizing, mobilizing, struggling to claim the rights that are legally theirs or that they believe should be theirs.
And the source gives some powerful examples.
It does. It mentions the abolitionist movement, fighting against slavery, fighting for basic human and civil rights for Black people, and then the later civil rights movements in America in the 20th century, fighting segregation, discrimination, trying to make that promise of legal equality a lived reality.
Huge struggle.
Huge. It also talks about working class movements in Europe, historically fighting for better conditions, union rights, political representation within those new industrial societies, fundamentally altering the power balance.
Right.
And it includes examples from India, too, mentioning Adivasi, that's tribal groups and Dalit movements, the so-called depressed classes, fighting against deep-seated discrimination, caste oppression, fighting for recognition, land rights, equal participation within their own specific context.
And these movements use different tactics.
Yes, the source notes they use both conventional politics, voting, lobbying, and unconventional, often disruptive activities. Things like protests, strikes, sit-ins, demonstrations, rallies, precisely to push for the practical realization of their rights, to achieve substantive citizenship when faced with resistance.
It's a powerful reminder, isn't it, that citizenship isn't just some gift handed down. It's often a status that's actively fought for, demanded, claimed from below.
Very much so.
And there's one final point in this opening section that kind of flips the historical script, something the material highlights as a significant shift over time. It observes that the original concept of citizenship focused almost exclusively on duty, what the individual owed the community. Rights were sort of in the background.
Right. Think about the ancient world. Civic duty, military service, participating in assemblies, contributing to the collective good. Those were paramount.
You were a citizen because you served.
Pretty much. Because you fulfilled these duties, contributed, owed allegiance, and service. The focus was heavily on what the individual owed the community or the state for its survival, its prosperity.
And the source contrasts that with today.
Quite sharply. It contrasts this with contemporary society, where citizenship is seen as primarily concerned with certain rights that individuals possess, the entitlements they have in relation to the state and other citizens.
So the focus shifted from duty to rights.
Largely, yes. Duties are still acknowledged, of course, things like paying taxes, obeying laws, but they're often accepted only because they're seen as essential for maintaining those rights the individual values.
Interesting.
This shift in emphasis from duty first to rights first marks a really significant evolution in how we tend to think about citizenship now, moving towards a more individualistic, right-centric understanding.
That's a fascinating contrast. From primarily duty-bound members whose service defined their belonging, to primarily rights-bearing individuals whose entitlements define their relationship with the state. Okay, let's take that trip back in time now, because your source material really guides us through the historical development of this idea, showing how it morphed and changed across different eras, different cultures.
Yeah, understanding the history is crucial for grasping the layers we see today.
Absolutely.
And the journey, as presented, starts way back, ancient world, Greek city-states, and the Roman Empire. But it's really important to understand, ancient Greek citizenship was very different from our modern idea.
How so?
Well, the source points out, Greek city-states weren't like our modern democratic nations where theoretically all adults are citizens.
Right, you mentioned it was incredibly limited, exclusive.
Extremely. In places like ancient Athens, only a tiny percentage of the people, like 10%, had the status of free men who were considered full citizens. Yeah. Everyone else is slaves, who were a huge part of the population, women, any foreigners living there totally excluded.
Wow.
But for that small group who were citizens, the material notes something interesting. They were considered equal among themselves regarding their rights, regardless of wealth or background. So internal equality within a highly unequal overall system.
But equality only within that tiny, privileged, native-born male group.
Exactly. And Aristotle, who's mentioned at the source, he saw citizenship specifically as a privilege of the ruling class, those capable of participating in governing, in deliberation.
So linked to power.
Fundamentally linked to effective participation in exercising power, attending assemblies, serving on juries, holding office. But interestingly, this privilege was also seen as a profound duty for those who held it. The duty to participate actively in governing the polis. It wasn't just a right to rule, it was a responsibility to rule.
So even way back then, in this exclusive context, you see that early link between power, privilege, and responsibility, but only for select few. What happened in Rome? The source presents that as the next major step, right?
After the Greek city-states declined, the Roman Republic and later the Empire evolved the concept significantly. Initially, Roman citizenship was also pretty confined to the power holders, the patricians, similar to early Greece.
Okay.
However, Rome took a different path over time, a more expansive path. They gradually extended citizenship beyond this elite group.
To whom?
Well, not just to ordinary free Romans, but remarkably, even to people in conquered territories, to those vanquished in war. Eventually, it was granted broadly throughout the empire.
That sounds huge compared to Greece.
It was a massive expansion in reach. It brought a much more diverse range of people under the umbrella of citizenship, though still excluding those at the very bottom, like slaves, and generally women from the full political side of things.
Okay, so wider reach, but the source notes a key difference in what citizenship meant.
Yes, a key difference in practice. A Roman citizen was no longer primarily defined as a protector of the law, someone actively involved in making and defending it, which was the Greek ideal. Instead, a Roman citizen was seen as someone who was under the protection of the laws.
Ah, so more passive.
The emphasis shifted from active civic participation to legal status and the protection provided by the state. And crucially, unlike that Greek ideal of equality among citizens, Roman practice actually allowed for different categories of citizens. People could have different sets of rights and privileges based on where they lived, their status, how they got citizenship.
So layers of inequality within Roman citizenship.
Exactly, which contrasts pretty starkly with the modern idea that citizenship implies fundamental equality and rights for all citizens.
Okay, so Rome expanded the reach dramatically, but introduced these internal inequalities while shifting the focus from active participation in law to passive protection by the law. That's a fundamental change in emphasis. What about after Rome fell, the medieval period?
The material mentions that briefly. During medieval Europe, the idea of temporal or worldly citizenship kind of got overshadowed by the dominant power of the church, ecclesiastical authority.
So religious identity became more important.
Well, feudal loyalties and religious identity often took precedence over civic identity. But the spark of the idea didn't completely vanish.
And then it popped up again during the Renaissance?
Yes. The source points to a reemergence, a revival in the 15th and 16th centuries, particularly in those vibrant Italian city republics, places like Florence, Venice.
Ah, Machiavelli's time.
Exactly. Figures like Machiavelli reflecting on civic life, the virtues needed for a successful republic. They gave a new lease on life to the idea of active citizenship.
And then the Enlightenment really kicked it into high gear, moving towards our modern understanding.
Absolutely. The 17th and 18th century saw huge developments philosophically and politically. In England, you had thinkers like James Harrington envisioning an empire of the laws, not of men.
Meaning rule by law, not by whim.
Precisely. A state based on impersonal legal rules, not the arbitrary will of a monarch. John Milton also contributed to ideas of civil liberty, public participation, and the whole concept gained more traction during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which limited the monarchy, asserted parliamentary power.
Okay.
Then in the 18th century, it became really prominent during the American Revolution in 1776, founding a republic based on popular sovereignty.
And the source says it reached a kind of peak with the French Revolution.
Yes, the French Revolution of 1789. That radical break from the old aristocratic system. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is highlighted as a key moment, explicitly linking the status of citizen to universal rights.
And this was heavily influenced by Rousseau.
Directly. The source connects this straight to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas, especially in his Social Contract from 1762.
Tell us more about Rousseau's influence here as your material presents it. He seems really pivotal.
Rousseau's view, which deeply influenced the French revolutionaries and echoes in that declaration, was that the citizen is fundamentally a free and autonomous person.
Okay.
They enter into a social contract, and as members of the sovereign body, what he called the general will, they are entitled to participate directly in all the decisions that bind everyone in the community.
Direct participation.
Yes, he was concerned about the rise of commercial society, individual self-interest. He thought it could create clashes between the common good and private interests, undermining social unity, civic virtue.
Right.
So he deliberately emphasized this concept of the general will, the collective will, aimed at the common good over private interests. It was a key, almost sacred aspect of citizenship for him. True liberty for Rousseau wasn't just freedom from the state, but freedom found in participating in forming that general will and then obeying laws you had a hand in creating.
So active direct participation and prioritizing the common good were absolutely central for Rousseau. Then the 19th century comes along, bringing the rise of liberalism, which seems to shift the focus back towards the individual, but now through the lens of rights. Is that right?
That's right. The rise of liberalism and market relations in the 19th century pushed forward a new dominant idea of citizenship, one based fundamentally on the idea of natural rights, rights inherent to the individual existing before the state.
And the source points to Locke here.
John Locke, yes, back in the late 17th century. He's seen as foundational with his concept of natural rights to life, liberty, and property.
And how did that connect to citizenship in this liberal view? How did it work?
Well, the Lockean idea, which became central to liberal thought, was that individuals have these rights in a state of nature. They set up the state through a social contract, specifically to protect and preserve these rights.
So the state's main job is security for individuals and their stuff.
Essentially, yes, to secure these inherent individual liberties and possessions. And crucially, if the state failed in this duty, if it infringed on these natural rights, the individual kept a right to resistance, the right to alter or abolish that government.
Right to revolution, basically.
In essence, this perspective led to citizenship being seen primarily as indicative of rights against the state.
Okay, rights against the state. What does that mean exactly?
These are what the source calls negative rights. They're defined mostly by the absence of state restraint or interference in certain fundamental activities of the individual. The state should leave you alone in these areas.
Like freedom of speech,
Right.
freedom of assembly, the right to own property, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Rights where the state's main role is simply not to interfere, to leave you alone. The state is seen as necessary, but its power should be limited. Citizenship is defined by the individual sphere of autonomy, protected from state intrusion. And the source notes this idea of negative rights was hugely important for developing liberal democratic societies, establishing those spheres of individual freedom. But then, eventually in the 20th century, it evolved towards the notion of positive rights in these societies.
Okay, positive rights, which is where the state isn't just not interfering, but actively helping or providing something.
Precisely. Positive rights are where the state extends its support to the individual to enable their self-development, their well-being.
Like what? Education, healthcare.
Exactly. Things like the right to education, healthcare, maybe a minimum standard of living. The source suggests this development, moving from negative to positive rights, brought the idea of citizenship to a more, let's say, complete form from this liberal perspective, going beyond just protection from the state to active support by the state, ensuring individuals have the capacity to actually exercise their freedoms and opportunities fully.
That transition from negative non-interference rights to positive enabling rights seems like a really crucial step in the evolution. It significantly expands the potential scope of citizenship and the state's role, too.
Definitely.
And it leads us directly into the next major section of your material, which really digs into the components of citizenship, especially through T.H. Marshall's influential analysis based on the English experience.
Marshall's framework, yeah, again from Citizenship and Social Class. It's a very influential, widely discussed way of breaking down citizenship into its parts. And understanding how they developed historically, at least in England, which is what he studied, he saw it as a progression, building layer upon layer.
And he identified three key stages, three components that got integrated over time, right?
Yes, he saw three distinct types of rights developing sequentially in England. He argued these formed the basis of substantive citizenship in a modern liberal democracy.
Yeah.
First, in the 18th century, came civil rights, which he associated with civil citizenship.
Okay, civil rights. What did those include, according to Marshall's view in the source?
These were the fundamental individual liberties, legal protections needed for individual freedom and also for participating in the market economy. Things like equality before the law, liberty of the person, so freedom from arbitrary arrest, freedom of speech, thought, faith, and crucially, the right to own property and make valid contracts.
And which institutions protected these?
Primarily the courts, upholding the rule of law. That was key for Marshall.
Okay, so the 18th century, basic legal freedoms, individual protections. What was the next stage Marshall saw?
The 19th century. This saw the development and expansion of political rights, forming political citizenship. These rights are all about participation in the exercise of political power, having a voice in how things are run.
So this is where voting rights come in?
Exactly. It includes the right to vote in elections for representative bodies, but also the right to be eligible for and to serve in bodies that hold political authority, whether that's local councils, legislatures, cabinets.
Okay, and the institutions for these?
Marshall links the protection and expression of political rights mainly to the representative political bodies themselves, parliament, elected assemblies, that sort of thing.
Got it. So first, legal status and personal freedoms, then the right to participate in governing, and the final stage in Marshall's sequence.
The 20th century. According to Marshall's analysis of England, this saw the emergence and consolidation of social rights, which make up social citizenship. These rights go beyond just civil and political stuff. They address basic welfare, security, and access to the shared resources of the society.
Social rights. What exactly are those, as defined here?
The source defines them as the right to a certain minimum standard of economic and social welfare, and the right to a full share in the social heritage. These are rights to provision, rather than just rights to protection or participation.
So the state providing things, and Marshall linked these two.
The social services and the education system. These were the key institutions he identified as responsible for providing and protecting social rights, ensuring citizens have access to basic necessities, security, opportunities for development.
And Marshall saw this whole progression, civil, political, social, culminating in what?
The development of the welfare state. In his view, the evolution of citizenship in England was essentially completed with the establishment and expansion of the welfare state, because that provided the institutional framework needed to realize social rights on a broad scale.
The material gives a pretty detailed picture of what a welfare state actually does in this context.
It does. It defines it based on the kinds of services provided. It's described as a state that provides various social services for the security and well-being of its citizens.
Like Social Security.
Yes, comprehensive social security, financial help or insurance against losing income due to unemployment, sickness, disability, injury, old age, death of the main earner, other major life events. It also covers essential services like free or subsidized education at different levels, public health services, healthcare, poor relief for those who can't work.
Wow, quite a list.
And even the supply of essential goods and services, like food, milk, fuel, public transport, perhaps subsidized for those in need. The source also mentions less obvious things, but related, like protecting cultural heritage monuments, museums, and promoting higher education and research. All seen as part of a welfare state's role in the overall development and sharing of society's resources.
That paints a really comprehensive picture of the state's role in ensuring social well-being. Much, much broader than that old night watchman state idea.
Oh, absolutely. Pulls apart.
And the material argues that these three components, civil, political, social rights, are kind of necessary elements that should be developed in any, humane, progressive state. And their scope can even be expanded further.
Yes, the underlying logic, aiming for full and equal membership, suggests they're fundamental pillars. They can be strengthened, expanded upon as society evolves, but the source is also very clear that just having these rights written down or having institutions set up doesn't automatically guarantee their effective provision or enjoyment.
Right, there's often that gap between the law and the lived reality.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to that formal versus substantive idea again. For civil rights, for instance, the source really stresses the need for non-discrimination. These rights have to apply equally to everyone, regardless of race, religion, language, gender, etc.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And it reiterates that even if the rights exist in law, they might be denied in practice through social prejudice, systemic barriers, outright oppression. When that happens, the source notes, it requires organized struggle, social movements forcing implementation.
And the example given is quite stark.
Very. The detailed example is the prolonged struggle of African Americans for civil rights in the 20th century. The Supreme Court ruled in 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, allowing unrestricted use of public property institutions like schools, declaring segregation unconstitutional.
A landmark ruling.
Huge. But, as the source highlights, Black Americans still had to endure over a decade of intense struggle, nonviolent protests, civil disobedience, political organizing, just to get those rights enforced across the country, especially in the South.
It wasn't automatic.
Not at all. This ultimately led to the passage of the landmark 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, laws that explicitly forbade racial discrimination in employment, education, accommodation, voting. It just shows how legal provisions often need active struggle to become reality for marginalized groups.
That's a powerful illustration of the gap between promise and practice and the role of citizens fighting for their own rights. What about ensuring political rights are effective? The source mentions examples where formal structures exist, but real political citizenship is missing.
Yeah, effective political rights, according to the source's definition here, mean citizens are genuinely eligible for public office. They have the unhindered ability to elect and replace rulers through fair processes. They can influence policy decisions. They can freely criticize government policies and offer alternatives without fear of repression.
Okay, so real influence and choice.
Exactly. And the material contrasts this sharply with the situation that existed in communist countries, like the People's Republic of China and the former USSR.
Where they had elections, but not real political citizenship in the way you just described.
Precisely. The source describes a system where political power was monopolized by one single party, the Communist Party. They held the exclusive right to nominate candidates for any important office.
So, no real choice on the ballot.
Right. Citizens might go to the polls, but they had no real choice between competing parties or candidates. No ability to elect genuine alternatives. And crucially, no effective legal or political way to replace the people in power or fundamentally change the direction of policy. They called themselves people's republics. But from the perspective of political rights defined here, the capacity to genuinely participate and influence power, citizens lacked them in the true sense.
And the source cites Tiananmen Square.
Yes, the Tiananmen Square demonstration in Beijing in 1989. A stark, tragic example. Thousands of students, citizens demanding democratic rights, more freedom, and end to corruption, met with violent suppression by the state. It illustrates that denial of fundamental political rights, the inability to challenge state power.
That makes the idea of political rights, the capacity to influence and replace power holders, incredibly concrete and incredibly valuable when it's denied. What about social rights? We talked about the welfare state, but what does the source say about their effective provision?
Well, as we discussed, social rights are largely provided through the mechanisms of a welfare state. The source contrasts this again with that earlier 19th century night watchman state, whose job was basically limited to law and order, protecting property, enforcing contracts. Taxation was minimal, just enough for those basic needs.
So the state's role in individual welfare was basically zero.
Pretty much. Welfare was left to private charity, family, your own means. The whole idea of the state actively providing Social Security and services, it really gained ground in Germany, late 19th century. Bismarck introduced social insurance programs, partly to head off socialist movements.
Ah, strategic.
Then it came to England in the early 20th century under liberal governments. And it really reached its peak conceptually and in implementation with the Beveridge Report in 1942 during World War II.
The famous report tackling the five great
That's
evils.
the one. William Beveridge identified 5 major roadblocks to social progress: want, poverty, disease, ill health, ignorance, lack of education, squalor, poor housing environment, and idleness, unemployment.
Quite a list.
And the report proposed a really comprehensive system: social insurance, services from cradle to grave, focusing particularly on providing financial help and security for unemployment, sickness, disability, old age.
And the source sees this as a model.
It holds up the post-war implementation of Beveridge's recommendations as turning England into a model welfare state, demonstrating how social rights could be institutionalized to ensure a basic level of security and well-being for all citizens.
Marshall's analysis of England's citizenship development was deeply shaped by this specific history, wasn't it?
Oh, definitely. The source notes that in England, these components seem to develop in a relatively clear, almost logical historical sequence.
Right. Civil, then political, then social.
Exactly. Civil rights in the 18th century created the atmosphere of individual freedom. That paved the way for democracy and political rights expanding in the 19th century, allowing broader participation. That political participation then created the conditions and the political will for the welfare state in the 20th century, which secured social rights.
A neat progression.
It seems logical, and the source suggests this order could potentially serve as a model or ideal. But then it immediately highlights comparative examples, showing it didn't happen that way everywhere. The relationship between these rights is much more complex in practice.
Like the United States, for example. How did it differ?
The source notes that in the U.S., the concept and practice of citizenship, especially regarding social rights, didn't develop in the same comprehensive way as in Europe. Civil rights were enshrined early, at least on paper for some, and political rights expanded over time. But the development of extensive social rights and a universal welfare state like the European models was much more limited, much more contested.
And even civil and political rights weren't universally applied from the start.
Exactly. The source explicitly states that both women and Black Americans, despite legal provisions, had to resort to mass movements specifically for the enforcement and full realization of their civil and political rights. It shows a different, more fractured path than Marshall's seemingly smooth English model.
Okay. And there's another critical contrast mentioned after World War II in Europe itself, showing different priorities.
Yes, the concept developed quite differently in Western and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. In Western Europe, generally under liberal democratic systems, civil and political rights were largely established first. Then came the significant development of social rights under the welfare state.
And the welfare state there was
Often seen as a mechanism developed by liberal democracies to kind of curb the potentially destabilizing unequal tendencies of capitalism, providing a social safety net, ensuring some level of equal opportunity.
Okay. And Eastern Europe under communist rule.
A very different story. There, the state initially prioritized and implemented relatively elaborate social and economic rights, guaranteed employment, housing, healthcare, education, etc. But, and this is the crucial point, civil and political rights were heavily curtailed. Restrictions on free speech, assembly, association, the right to genuinely choose or oppose the government.
So social rights were provided, but at the expense of civil and political freedom.
That's the trade-off they imposed. And what happened?
It didn't hold.
The source points out this imbalance proved unsustainable. From 1989 to 1991, you saw widespread anti-establishment movements erupt across Eastern Europe.
Right, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all of that.
Exactly. Millions of citizens demanding basic civil and political rights, the right to speak freely, to organize, to have real elections, to change their governments. These demands for fundamental liberties and participation rights, the very definition of civil and political citizenship, ultimately led to the collapse of those communist systems.
Wow.
It shows that while social rights are important, having them provided by an authoritarian state just cannot substitute for the civil liberties and political agency that citizens demand to be full members of a community.
That really highlights the different paths citizenship can take, the different ways these components can be prioritized or suppressed, and maybe the importance in having that full spectrum of rights for a stable, just society. Speaking of different paths and perspectives, your material then shifts gears a bit. It looks at different contemporary theories of citizenship. So it's not just about history, it's about ongoing debates over what citizenship is fundamentally about.
Exactly. The source presents 5 particularly important contemporary theories. They offer different logical bases, different foundational ideas, and different scopes for understanding citizenship today. Distinct lenses, really, for viewing that relationship between the individual and the state and what its core purpose should be.
And these are the liberal, libertarian, communitarian, Marxist, and pluralist theories. Let's dive into each one as the material details them. Understand their core ideas, their goals. Starting with the liberal theory, which seems to build right on that Marshallian perspective we just covered.
Right? The liberal theory, often called the evolutionary theory here, takes civil rights as the foundation. It sees citizenship as a status that progressed through those historical stages, acquiring political rights, then social rights, culminating in the welfare state.
So Marshall's model, basically.
Very much aligned with Marshall. This view sees citizenship as prescribing equal rights, duties, liberties, constraints, powers, responsibilities for everyone. It's seen as a force countering social divisions, especially class divisions from the market economy, promoting a basic equal status for all citizens.
And the ultimate goal of this evolutionary process in this view.
The goal is achieving the welfare state and ultimately enhancing citizens' welfare, broadly speaking. When citizenship is fully developed in this way, it leads to state-led redistribution of resources.
Redistribution for social justice.
Aimed at social justice, yeah. Ensuring everyone has access to basic necessities, opportunities, a share in the common social and cultural heritage. In this process, achieving social rights and welfare is also seen as strengthening citizens' sense of duty and allegiance because they feel the state is looking after them.
The method is described as the rational allocation of benefits and burdens by the state. Sounds quite bureaucratic.
It is. A structured state-led approach, distributing resources and responsibilities based on citizenship principles, often guided by ideas of fairness and need. However, the critique mentioned in the source is that this theory might be a bit too optimistic.
Optimistic about what?
About how smoothly this redistribution works and how socially accepted it is. The critique notes that redistribution aiming for social justice inherently means taxing some people, often the wealthier or more productive, to provide benefits to others.
Right, someone has to pay.
Exactly. Nothing's really free. If someone gets a benefit, someone else is paying, directly or indirectly. And maintaining goodwill, social solidarity, political support for this system, the source argues, when taxpayers feel the burden, maybe some heartburn or resentment, that's a really difficult ongoing political task. It's not just an automatic happy outcome of citizenship evolving.
A practical political reality. Check on the theory. Okay, next up, the libertarian theory. How does this approach citizenship? It sounds very different from the liberal view.
Oh, radically different. The libertarian theory starts from a place of strong individualism, primacy of individual liberty, property rights. It sees citizenship not as some organic, evolving status for collective welfare, but as a product of free choice and contract among individuals. The market society is its model for civic life.
And Robert Nozick is the key name here.
Yes, Nozick is cited as a chief exponent, especially his influential book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, arguing for a minimal state.
So individuals just pursuing their own interests in a free market.
Pretty much. Individuals are seen as rational actors. They pursue their values, their goals, mainly through private activity, voluntary market exchange, voluntary association. The need for a state, and therefore for citizenship as a relationship with it, only arises for a very limited set of necessary public goods and services. Things individuals can't realistically get or protect privately.
Like what? Police protection? Courts?
Yeah. Things like protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, basic security functions. The citizen in this model is basically viewed as a rational consumer of these specific public goods provided by the state.
So the state is like a service provider and
Right.
citizens are customers. That sounds different.
The source explicitly notes Nozick likens the state to a large enterprise, citizens as customers or clients. Individuals need protection, so they hire protective institutions. The minimal state is just seen as the most efficient one, legitimately holding a monopoly on force within a territory to provide this protection.
So the goal is just efficient provision of basic security.
The goal is simply the efficient provision of those very necessary public goods, primarily protection and contract enforcement, and the method is basically paying the state for its limited services, presumably through taxes seen as a service fee.
Okay. What's the critique of this view?
The critique presented in the source is pretty sharp. It points to a fundamental weakness. This free market individualism lacks an adequate foundation for social solidarity beyond pure self-interest or voluntary deals. This model the source argues, would inevitably lead to sharp disputes and tense clashes of interest, especially over collective goods.
Because people wouldn't want to pay for things they don't directly use. Is that the idea?
Exactly. The critique asks pointed questions. Why should healthy, wealthy people who don't use public hospitals or state schools pay for them through taxes? Why should someone without much property fund a police force mainly protecting property? Why pay for public parks if you never go?
Right.
Following this logic, the argument could easily extend to replacing most state services with private insurance, voluntary arrangements, potentially making government as we know it, and citizenship as a collective project requiring shared burdens, kind of redundant or irrelevant beyond that minimal protection.
So, the libertarian view, while maybe logically consistent with radical individualism, is criticized for potentially dissolving the social bonds and collective responsibilities that other theories see as central to citizenship. Okay, let's shift again. The communitarian or Republican theory. This sounds like it puts much more emphasis on the collective.
It does. It stands in strong contrast to the libertarian view. It insists on a strong bond of affinity, identification between the individual and the state or community. The key feature here, highlighted in the source, is citizen participation, active engagement.
Active involvement in shaping society is the core.
Absolutely. The ideal citizen here isn't just a passive recipient of rights or consumer of services. They're an active participant who plays a crucial role in shaping society through political debate, deliberation, decision-making. Key names mentioned are Hannah Arendt, Michael Walzer, Benjamin Barber.
So citizenship is about identifying with the community, joining in.
Yes, strongly identifying with the community, participating in its political life, working towards realizing the common interest or common good. It involves actively engaging with, and maybe assimilating to some extent, the community's culture, traditions, beliefs, sentiments, to become a committed member working for shared goals.
And the source links this back to Rousseau again.
It does, connecting it back to Rousseau's general will, that collective will aimed at the common good, based on an image of a close-knit, participatory society where everyone's real will ideally converges. The goal of citizenship for communitarians is simply the common good.
And the method is active citizen participation.
Right. Through deliberation, debate, collective decision-making, the common good is found and pursued. However, the big critique presented in the source against this model is about feasibility.
It sounds nice, but maybe hard to achieve.
The critique suggests it's perhaps only suitable or truly feasible for small, relatively homogeneous societies. Places with strong shared traditions, values, like ancient Athens for its limited citizenry, or maybe 15th century Florence.
Not so easy in big, diverse modern societies.
Exactly. The source argues it's not practically feasible in today's large, complex, diverse, often fragmented modern societies to find a single, unifying general will acceptable to the consciousness of the entire community. Even with widespread debate, there's just too much diversity of interests, values, identities.
A compelling critique in our world today. Finding one common good everyone agrees on seems challenging. Okay, let's tackle the Marxist theory of citizenship. This sounds like it takes a very different view of where rights come from.
It takes a fundamentally critical approach, yes.
Yeah.
It views the rights and status associated with citizenship not as products of natural evolution or social contract, but as the product of underlying social and economic structures, specifically class conflict.
So rights aren't given, they're won through struggle.
From this perspective, rights aren't just granted or evolved nicely. They are fought for and won, often by one class struggling against or suppressing another. Anthony Giddens, the sociologist, is identified as a key exponent here, particularly known for his critiques of Marshall's more evolutionary story.
What were Giddens' main criticisms of Marshall, according to your source material?
Giddens argues Marshall's evolutionary account, civil, then political, then social rights in England, is an oversimplification, maybe a bit idealistic. He feels Marshall ignores the crucial role of political power struggles, the state's active role, and especially the agency of subordinate groups in achieving rights. Marshall makes it sound almost like a natural automatic process, guided by some beneficent hand of progress.
Whereas Giddens says it was tougher than that.
Giddens insists the underprivileged classes and groups achieve citizenship rights mainly through active struggle, organizing, protesting, challenging the established powers, often during times of major social upheaval or war, when the power balance shifted.
So not a smooth, one-way evolution where rights are just handed out.
Correct. Giddens also disagrees with Marshall's idea of a single, unilinear, progressive development that applies everywhere. He sees citizenship rights as the product of various social movements and class struggles in different contexts. and the specific benefits won and institutionalized varied significantly depending on the strength and success of those movements at different times and places.
Can you give an example of that variation?
The source cites the erosion of welfare rights, the scaling back of the welfare state in the US and UK in the 1970s and 80s under Reagan and Thatcher. That's evidence, Giddens might argue, that the development isn't just a one-way street towards more rights and welfare. Gains can be challenged, rolled back, depending on the political climate and the power of opposing forces.
And Giddens also categorizes rights differently than Marshall.
Yes, unlike Marshall's single category, civil, political, social, all part of citizenship status, Giddens identifies two types of rights belonging to distinct categories, reflecting different stages of class struggle within capitalism.
Okay, what are the two types?
First, individual freedom and equality before the law, basically. Civil rights like free speech, property rights. Giddens argues these were primarily won by the emergent bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, in their fight against feudal privilege and aristocracy. And their establishment actually helped consolidate industrial capitalism and the modern state by creating a system based on contract and formal equality needed for market relations.
So civil rights serve the capitalist class initially. What's the second type?
Second, he identifies economic civil rights, things like the right to form trade unions, collective bargaining rights, the right to strike. These, he argues, were specifically fought for by the working class and trade unions against bourgeois power. They represented an attempt to challenge the dominance of capital, gain power in the workplace and economy.
So different classes fought for different types of rights, serving their interests within capitalism.
Precisely. Giddens also connects the development of citizenship in modern democracy to the expansion of state power in administration, starting significantly around the late 16th century. This led to increased state surveillance capacity, the state's ability to gather info, monitor people, enforce rules.
Okay.
But paradoxically, from a traditional Marxist view of the state as purely repressive, this increased the state's dependence on the cooperation and consent of its population, not just relying on force.
Interesting. More power, but also more need for cooperation.
Yes, this interdependence, this need for voluntary compliance and information generated opportunities for subordinate groups to exert pressure, influence rulers, what Giddens calls a two-way expansion of power between state and society.
The state gets more reach, but that makes it more reliant on the people, opening avenues for influence.
Exactly. And interestingly, the source notes that in a later work, The Nation, State, and Violence, Giddens made a significant concession or refinement to his earlier Marxist analysis. He conceded that contemporary capitalism, especially under welfare capitalism in the 20th century, does effectively safeguard working-class civil rights, including those economic ones like union rights. And in doing so, it actually consolidates and stabilizes the industrial capitalist system rather than fundamentally challenging it.
So, accepting that citizenship rights can work within the system.
Right. It's presented as a departure from original revolutionary Marxism, acknowledging that citizenship rights can be maintained and even play a role in maintaining the existing system within a liberal democracy.
A notable shift in his thinking, recognizing how those struggles fundamentally changed the system they were fighting within. Okay, finally, let's look at the pluralist theory. The source presents this as a more encompassing approach.
The pluralist theory views citizenship development and its nature as inherently complex, multidimensional. It explicitly rejects blaming it all on a single cause, whether that's Marshall's neat evolution or just class struggle like early Marxists. Instead, it insists we pay attention to the interplay of diverse factors and power dynamics.
So looking beyond just class to understand who's included or excluded.
Absolutely. David Held is cited as a key exponent. The theory emphasizes the reciprocal relationship between individual and community rights on one side, duties on the other, interdependent, two sides of the coin, both essential.
And participation is important here too.
Yes, the essence, like communitarianism, is seen as participation in community life. But the key pluralist insight, strongly highlighted by Held and the source, is that people have been barred from full, equal citizenship, not just by class, but by a multitude of other grounds. Gender, race, age, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, many other factors.
So discrimination across many different lines is central to the pluralist view.
Yes. The pluralist theory insists on investigating and challenging all types of social discrimination. Gender, race, religion, property, education, occupation, age, and so on. It sees citizenship as closely linked to the broader struggle for universal human rights, and it views the analysis of citizenship as inseparable from the actions and demands of diverse social movements.
Not just workers' movements then, but lots of different kinds of movements?
No, exactly. The source lists many examples. The feminist movement fighting gender discrimination, the Black movement fighting racial oppression, religious reform movements, the workers' movement, children's rights movements, the Dalit and Adivasi movements in India fighting caste and tribal discrimination, even the ecological movement raising questions about citizens' duties towards the environment and future generations.
A very broad scope.
The problem of achieving full, equal citizenship from this pluralist view has to be analyzed in the context of all these varied struggles against different types of social discrimination and exclusion.
And because these movements are always active, always challenging boundaries.
The analysis of citizenship becomes a subject of continuous research, continuous reevaluation. The source notes the pluralist theory is still very much developing, no single fixed framework. People like B.S. Turner also contribute significantly. Its strength is precisely this comprehensive approach. Recognizing the multifaceted nature of exclusion and the vital ongoing role of diverse social movements in fighting for inclusion, recognition, and the full realization of citizenship for everyone, regardless of the potential grounds for discrimination.
Wow. So many different and sometimes conflicting ways to think about what citizenship is for, where it comes from, what it should achieve. You've got Marshall's liberal evolutionary rights package, ending in the welfare state for citizen welfare. The libertarians' contract-based consumer model focused only on necessary public goods.
Right.
The communitarians' emphasis on active participation for the common good.
Very different feel.
The Marxist view of rights, born from class struggle and state-society interaction, and then the pluralists' focus on fighting diverse discrimination through many social movements. Each gives us a distinct perspective on the logic, the goal, the method.
And they often highlight the tensions, right? The compromises, the challenges involved in actually realizing that ideal of full and equal membership. The critiques against each theory really underscore that none of them offer a universally accepted, easy-to-implement, problem-free blueprint for citizenship. They reveal how contested the concept itself is.
Exactly. And even with all this rich history, the different theories, the legal frameworks we've discussed, your source material powerfully points out that the common understanding of citizenship doesn't yet fully deliver on its promise, not for all parts of society. It highlights two really significant critiques that directly challenge the reality of citizenship as it's practiced today, showing where the ideal falls short.
Yes, these critiques argue that even when formal legal citizenship exists on paper, certain groups still suffer effective subjection, marginalization, discrimination in practice. They're treated as less than full or equal members. The source focuses on two key ones: the feminist critique and the subaltern critique.
Let's start with the feminist critique. What's its core argument as presented in the material?
The core argument is that legal citizenship, while necessary and important, hasn't been enough to eliminate the subjection and unequal status women face in social and political life. The source notes that since the modern feminist movement really took off, say, 1960s, 70s onwards, women's status and that gap between formal and substantive citizenship for them became a central issue in these discussions.
And it pushes back against some older explanations for why women didn't participate fully in politics.
It does. Earlier thinking, even some historical analysis, sometimes assumed that getting legal equality, like the right to vote, which came quite late in many places, that basically solved the problem of women's exclusion. Low voting among women early on was sometimes explained away by suggesting, oh, they're just not interested in public life, they're busy with private domestic stuff, or they don't have time because of housework.
Right, those old tropes.
But the source points out, with huge social changes in the 20th century, smaller families, women entering the paid workforce in massive numbers, that explanation just didn't hold water anymore. It couldn't account for the persistent disparities.
Yet, despite more women voting, working, the material points out a significant, stubborn representation gap in political power.
This is a key piece of the feminist critique here in your sources. The source gives some striking statistics, really highlights the stark contrast between women's numbers in the electorate and their presence in positions of political authority.
Like what?
It points out electorates might be nearly 50% women, reflecting formal political citizenship. But legislative membership in many countries, especially Western Europe, North America, at the time the source refers to, was often way below 10%. It specifically mentions the British House of Commons, the U.S. House of Representatives having less than 5% women members then, a massive disparity.
That's enormous. Half the population, but barely represented in the bodies making the laws.
It is. The source contrasts this with Scandinavian countries like Sweden, 26%, and Norway, 34% at the time, showing higher representation was possible. But the global reality was often much lower. And the example from international politics is even more stark.
Which one was that?
The signing of the Charter of Paris in 1990, a major international agreement, 34 heads of government involved. Only 2 women among them, Gro Brundtland of Norway and Margaret Thatcher of Britain, and Thatcher resigned shortly after.
Wow.
That image really drives home the point about the historical lack of women in top political leadership globally, despite formal citizenship rights.
And the critical feminist question, as the source puts it, gets right to the heart of it. What's the real meaning or consequence of giving women full legal citizenship if their representation in public life, where the big decisions are made, stays so negligible? If their voices aren't proportionally there?
Exactly. And critically, the source is clear, based on the feminist analysis presented. This disparity, this inferior status, is not because of inherent biological differences between men and women.
Absolutely crucial point. Can't stress that enough.
The material emphasizes. Biological differences do not account for this. The real causes are identified as deep-seated social and cultural conditioning,
Such as?
such as the disproportionate burden and time women traditionally spend on unpaid domestic work, child rearing. That limits their opportunities for personal development, professional advancement, engagement in public and political life.
And the way boys and girls are socialized differently reinforces these roles from a young age.
Yes. The source details how women have historically been taught the private domestic sphere is their proper place. Not public life, not the world of politics and power. Girls, it notes, are often taught to prioritize personal relations, be obedient, shy, submissive. Steered towards careers seen as extensions of domestic roles, teaching, nursing, secretarial work.
Whereas boys are taught.
Boys, on the other hand, encouraged to be firm, assertive, aggressive, competitive, pushed towards careers associated with public authority, higher status doctors, engineers, lawyers. This fundamental difference in training, the source argues, actively hinders women from developing the traits, the networks, the experience often seen as necessary or beneficial for successful political careers.
So the social structure, the cultural expectations, the upbringing, they actively create barriers preventing women from fully exercising the potential that their formal citizenship should allow.
Exactly. Therefore, the feminist assertion, according to the source, is that the concept of citizenship cannot be considered logically complete, fully realized, truly universal, until equal participation of women in public life and positions of authority is achieved.
And it mentions an example from India.
Yes. India's constitutional amendment reserving 1/3 of seats in local village councils, panchayats, for women is given as a concrete, though initial step at the grassroots level to address this gap, with goals of increasing representation further, in higher legislatures too, and helping women enter administration and professions through better higher education opportunities.
That makes the feminist critique very concrete. Formal citizenship exists, but deep social and cultural barriers, not inherent differences, prevent substantive citizenship regarding equal political representation and opportunity. Okay, let's look at the subaltern critique. This addresses similar issues of practical inequality, but based on different grounds.
Yes, the term subaltern literally means of inferior rank or status. The subaltern critique addresses situations where people are legally equal citizens, they have the passport, the vote, but are systematically treated as superior or inferior in social practice, based on factors other than their formal status.
And this concept originally came from Gramsci, the Italian Marxist.
Yes, Antonio Gramsci. He used subaltern in his analysis of capitalism and power. He applied it to groups subject to the hegemony of ruling classes. Hegemony for Gramsci isn't just rule by force. It's the ruling class subtly convincing others their interests are universal, natural, making the rule seem legitimate, consensual.
Oh, okay.
So in capitalism, even with formal equal rights, Gramsci argued capitalists are the ruling class exercising hegemony. And subordinate groups, peasants, workers, marginalized communities denied access to this hegemonic power are subaltern. He criticized traditional history for focusing only on ruling classes, calling it one-sided. He wanted inquiry into the subaltern class's role, their resistance, contributions, opposition movements for a fuller picture.
But the subaltern critique, as presented here, has expanded beyond just Gramsci's original focus on class within capitalism.
Significantly. In contemporary analysis, subaltern theory and the subaltern critique of citizenship apply more broadly. To any group suffering systematic discrimination, marginalization, denial of full social status on irrelevant grounds that are arbitrary, disregarding their fundamental human status and legal equality. This contemporary interpretation is explicitly linked to universal human rights in the source.
What kind of irrelevant grounds create these subaltern groups today? What examples does the source give?
It lists a wide range: gender, overlapping with the feminist critique; age, vocation, occupation; class, economic sense; caste, like in India; race, region, religion, language, culture, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and so on.
So many potential bases for being treated as inferior.
Members of these groups might hold formal citizenship, but they're often looked down upon, marginalized, discriminated against, subjected to prejudice by dominant groups, due to deep-rooted hatred, prejudice, stereotypes, even superstitions.
So, despite legal equality on paper, social reality creates these inferior ranks, these disadvantages. And the reasons, like with the feminist critique, are systemic barriers, not inherent flaws.
Not at all inherent flaws.
Yes.
The source points to the real causes of their inferior status and marginalization: systemic deprivations, lack of opportunity.
Such as?
These groups are often deprived of opportunities for quality education, enlightenment, access to modern professions, economic mobility, participation in the common cultural heritage. They might lack effective legal protection, the means to organize, adequate channels to voice grievances, demand justice. They're systematically disadvantaged, excluded from mainstream power and opportunities.
They are effectively excluded from substantive citizenship through these layers of social and economic barriers.
Exactly. And the conclusion drawn in the source from this subaltern critique is really a call to action for the broader society.
What does it say?
It states that if the idea of citizenship is to be realized in the true sense, as full and equal membership, then enlightened sections of society, those who understand these dynamics, hold positions of influence, must actively come to the rescue and aid of these subaltern groups. Their full inclusion, equal status, access to opportunities require conscious effort from the entire community to dismantle these layers of discrimination, prejudice, deprivation that persist despite formal legal equality.
That's a powerful and necessary call to action, acknowledging that achieving true substantive citizenship for everyone requires actively confronting and dismantling those deep-seated social inequalities and prejudices that persist even when the law says everyone is equal. It means working to make the promise of citizenship a reality for every member of society.
A constant struggle.
Wow. Okay. That was a truly comprehensive deep dive into the concept of citizenship, all guided by your source material. We started right back at the beginning, that fundamental definition, that crucial two-way street between individual and state, and that revolutionary idea of the citizen replacing the subject. We traced its fascinating, sometimes rocky history, from limited ancient privilege to expanded Roman protection, its reemergence in republics, the boost from the Enlightenment and revolutions, leading to negative rights against the state, and later, positive rights demanding state support.
And we broke down the components through Marshall's influential lens, tracing that evolution from civil rights protecting liberties, to political rights enabling participation, to social rights providing welfare and access, culminating in the welfare state idea.
But we also saw, through your sources, how it unfolded differently, like the U.S. compared to England, and how the balance of these rights was dramatically different between liberal democracies and communist dictatorships, with huge real-world consequences, like regimes collapsing when they denied civil and political rights.
Huge consequences.
We then grappled with those 5 distinct contemporary theories, offering different answers to that fundamental question: what's citizenship ultimately for? From the liberal idea of evolving rights and the welfare state for citizen welfare, to the libertarian focus on choice and minimal state services, the communitarian ideal of active participation for the common good, the Marxist view of rights born from class struggle and state power dynamics.
Right.
And the pluralist perspective, highlighting the ongoing fight against diverse discriminations through many social movements. Each theory gave us a powerful, though often contested lens.
Definitely contested.
And finally, we confronted those powerful critiques, challenging the reality of citizenship today, showing where the ideal falls short. We saw how, even with formal legal rights, the feminist critique highlights how social conditioning and lack of representation deny women full substantive citizenship in public life. And the subaltern critique reveals how various groups are treated as inferior in practice due to deep-seated discrimination, systemic deprivation based on irrelevant grounds, despite their legal status.
Your source material really shows us citizenship is far from static, far from simple. Not just something you check off when you get a passport.
Not at all.
It's dynamic, contested, constantly evolving, shaped by history, power struggles, social movements, ongoing debates about who belongs, what rights are essential for full membership, whose voices and experiences actually count in shaping the community. Understanding these layers, the history, components, theories, critiques, is absolutely key to being truly well-informed about the societies we live in, how they function, or maybe how they should function, to live up to that ideal of citizenship.
It really isn't just about holding a piece of paper anymore, is it?
No, the material really pushes us to think about the lived reality, the continuous struggle for full, equal citizenship.
It really does. And given all these different theories, we discussed the liberal evolution towards welfare, the communitarian participation idea, the Marxist struggle perspective, the pluralist focus on diverse movements, and considering those persistent critiques from feminist and subaltern viewpoints, highlighting how formal rights haven't delivered substantive equality for everyone. This raises an important question for you, our listener, building on the material you shared, to consider. How should societies, looking at this history, these theories, these critiques, how should societies continue to evolve the practice of citizenship today? How do we truly bridge that gap between formal status and the ideal of full and equal membership and participation for all members, regardless of gender, background, or social status?
A big question to ponder. How do we make the practice match the ideal?
Something to mull over long after this deep dive ends. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of citizenship.